Hey there. So today we're going to tell you the story about 1984, written by George Orwell. Um, as with all of my stories that I tell, I am going to try to only stick to the story so that you can interpret it any way that you see fit. Um, I'll try to do that, but who knows if I will wander off. So let's share the screen here and tell you the story of 1984. Hopefully, you are now seeing this. So, 1984 was written by a guy named George Orwell, who was British. Um, you might know his other famous work called Animal Farm. He wrote before this. This book was published in 1949. So, if you know anything about your history, you know this is occurring after World War II. And as those things kind of settled out, now he did see firsthand the totalitarian regimes in Spain during their civil war. Obviously, Hitler during World War II, and Stalin's reign in the Soviet Union. And that's kind of what he based this book upon. It takes place in 1984. So this was kind of like what the future was going to be. This is kind of like one of the more important dystopian novels that was ever written. You see a lot of dystopian movies around today, especially with zombies and things like that. But this is kind of the most famous one. Everything in London during this time, where he lived, in a country called Oceania, was dilapidated and worn down, and nothing seemed to work. Everywhere you saw signs that said Big Brother is watching you. Every room that you entered had something called a telescreen in it that was kind of like a two-way screen that was watching you. Even if you're someone like Winston, who's the main character, and he was part of the ruling class. We'll talk more about what he did for a living in a minute, but so he wasn't like being oppressed or whatever. He was in the ruling class. Big Brother taught the people of Oceania this slogan: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And I really want you to think about that. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And see if there's any truth in those words. There was something inside Winston who didn't believe these things, who believed that there was something about freedom and independence. But he knew that it was dangerous to even think like that. He started a diary, and one of the first pages in the diary that he wrote down with Big Brother numerous times along the piece of paper, even though he knew that just by thinking these things that he could be caught and tortured by the thought police. That's right, the thought police, who even supposedly patrolled what you thought. And just as he was thinking this, there was a knock at the door. Who could it be? It turns out it's only a neighbor who needs help. So needs help with the plumbing. Like I said, nothing really worked in Oceania. Everything was kind of worn down. And while he's over there trying to fix the plumbing, the children of his neighbors are upset because the mother won't let the children go see the torture of some enemies of the state. I'm not sure if he goes home or not, but somewhere he starts to think of a guy named O'Brien. O'Brien works for the government, and it's someone like that Winston likes, that Winston somehow senses that O'Brien has the same feelings towards Big Brother and independence and freedom that he does. And he remembers O'Brien telling him that they will meet one day in the place where there is no darkness. And that's kind of gives Winston hope that there's someplace in the world that is full of light and joy and all of these things. Winston dreams of his mother, and that he's on a sinking ship with them, and he suddenly wakes up by uttering the word Shakespeare. He has no idea what that means. He doesn't know who Shakespeare is. He doesn't even know the name, the word, but it must be connected somehow to the old days, and maybe even with his mother. But this is how far we've gotten into 1984, is the elimination of things like Shakespeare. Just then there's a whistle that wakes everybody up, and everyone's supposed to do what they call physical jerks in front of the telescreen. So he's kind of he's going through the motions, and he recalls about, excuse me, how part of his job is changing the records of the country. And he knows that it has been done. He knows that no one can recall Big Brother before, like the 1960s, but now the records show that Big Brother was alive and well and ruling the country back into the 1930s. Again, this is the idea of changing what the truth is, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But just then the telescreen wakes up and reprimands Winston for not putting forth the proper effort in his morning calisthenics. Again, Big Brother is watching. So again, Winston works at what's called the Ministry of Truth. They have the Ministry of Truth, and another interesting ministry in the government is called the Ministry of Love, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. And what Winston does is he updates the records so that Big Brother is never wrong. So he has to go back, Winston does, in the history books and the photographs and the speeches, and make changes as time passes, so that when people look back into the history, there's no evidence that Big Brother has ever been wrong. So that's kind of why he knows things aren't really the way that they seem to be. He has a friend named Syme who is not in charge, but he works for the division of the language department in the government, that the official language of Oceania is called Newspeak. And so they have to change the definitions of words all the time, and this is what Syme does. He changes he changes the definition of words to meet what Big Brother is doing and what Big Brother means. For example, the Ministry of Plenty, while I think they were having lunch or something, the Ministry of Plenty comes over the loudspeakers and announces that there's been an increase in the chocolate allocation of every person. And everyone kind of goes along with this, and Winston is confused because it's actually a decrease from the day before. But again, it's this idea that Big Brother is never wrong. He also sees this dark-haired girl who works in some other ministry. Winston's afraid she's watching him. He knows that he's committed a thought crime, and so is wondering if people are looking out for him. One thing too about Big Brother is the idea of sex has been made into an evil thing, and so nobody has sex, or supposedly they don't. But it's something that Winston would really like to have. Maybe even with the dark-haired girl who's watching him. Winston talks a little bit about how the society is made up here in chapter 7. There's a group of people called the proles, who are like downtrodden, the poorest of the poor, the lower classes. And Winston believes that only in the proles is there hope for the future, because the government kind of leaves them alone, supposedly leaves them alone because they have so less power than anybody else, and so less economic power and all that kind of stuff. There are people, though, who are fighting against the government and Big Brother. One of those organizations is called the Brotherhood, supposedly, and there's a leader of the Brotherhood, I forget his name, Goldstein, I think, who is fighting against what Big Brother stands for. Um, but Winston is still confused about the past. He knows that there are things like the government claims that things like the literacy rate and infant mortality and all of these kind of things, the economic output, all of those things are doing fantastically, but he knows that they're all lies. But yet everyone goes along with it. And this quote in the book is kind of famous. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. So whatever the government was telling them was the truth is what everyone kind of went along with. And it's not like they didn't recognize what they were doing was not the truth, but bad things happen to people who don't believe in the truth. And again, there's the guy O'Brien that he really thinks, Winston does, that maybe O'Brien can be someone that he can confide in and work with and maybe fight against Big Brother. Winston starts to wander through the prole section of the city, and he meets an old man who has like a secondhand shop. And I don't know if it's here or not, where he buys a paperweight, like a snow globe kind of thing of a church on the inside. It becomes important to him, St. Catherine's Church, I believe. But then he goes out in the street and he sees that same girl following him, and he knows that she's out to get him. And he wonders if maybe he should just commit suicide and not have to go through all the torture that is rumored to happen to people who commit thought crimes. But he thinks of O'Brien again, and he thinks maybe there's somebody out there or a group of people that he can connect with that can help him fight what he thinks is wrong. Yes. So he's back at work, Winston is, and he sees that same girl following him. Girl's got, I think she's like in a sling, and they kind of walk towards each other, and she falls down in front of him, and he reaches down to help her up, and she slips him a note, and then the note says, "I love you." And so now Winston is really confused. He thought she was a spy. Maybe she's not a spy. Maybe she really loves him. And so this kind of gives him what he says, a desire to live. They manage to sit at the same table for lunch, and they have to like look down and not pretend like they're not talking to each other while they're talking to each other. And they agree to meet at a square that's full of people. There's something going on throughout the book called Hate Week, where people are supposed to express their hatreds towards the enemies of Big Brother. And there's an event at a square where all these people are supposed to be at. And so it'd be hard to see individuals in the square. So they meet up, and they make a plan to meet again, and they briefly hold hands, and there's some sweetness in this moment that maybe there can be this relationship in the midst of this horror. So they meet again somewhere else, and they they find out that the woman's name is Julia. Winston does. Julia rips off her Junior Anti-Sex League sash that she wears, and they enjoy each other, if you know what I mean. They talk more and they meet more, and Winston asks Julia if she's had sex with other men, and she says, "Oh, all the time." And you would think that would mean that there would be another conversation, but Winston says he loves her more because of that, because of those moments where she is doing things that the government is telling her not to do. And he remembers the differences that he had with his wife when they found out that they couldn't have kids. Then they separated from each other. And Winston's beginning to think she's kind of, oh yeah, maybe this is later. So Winston is married, but they don't live together or talk to each other. Winston then rents a room above the secondhand shop that he bought the paperweight at. Mr. Charrington is the guy that owns the building, and they rent this room. He rents this room so he can meet up with Julia whenever he wants to. And the room, it has the paperweight of the church. There's also like a painting of the church on the wall. And he kind of feels that there may be some connection to the past in this room. So he's sitting there and he's hoping that his wife will die so that he can marry Julia. And one day when Julia and Winston are in this room, Julia says that she thinks that the enemies of the government, like the Brotherhood and the leaders and all of those people, are inventions of the government to make like a common enemy for the people of the government to, or the people of the country to unite around to hate. And Winston scolds her, and he's like, that's no way to think. Like we can, there's got to be hope. There's got to be some people who think like them. So if you're kind of seeing that Julia is fighting against the government, but just for her own purposes, for her own individual pleasure, while Winston kind of has this much broader idea of fighting against the government. So they have some kind of a disagreement there. Winston talks with his friend O'Brien again, and O'Brien says, come over to my house and I'll show you the new dictionary of Newspeak that he's writing. And this is when he expresses his fear of the ministry of love. The ministry of love is not the ministry of love. It's the ministry of fear and hate. And it looks for people who are violating these personal relationships and the sexual laws of the country. He wakes up one morning. Winston does crying. He had a dream where he thinks he kills his mother. He killed his mother, but he's not sure. But he hates the government, the party, for eliminating the feelings that people have. That there's no feelings amongst people anymore. And the only humans that he really thinks are humane people are the proles, are this lower class, are these downtrodden people. Julia and Winston are up in the room above the secondhand store, and they realize that by having the room, that it's more likely that they will be captured. But neither of them want to leave, so that's kind of sweet. Winston and Julia go to O'Brien's house, and O'Brien turns off the telescreen of Big Brother that's watching them. And they both thought this was amazing. And finally, they both admit that they would like to join the Brotherhood. And O'Brien says, yes, I know how to do that. And he has like some sort of initiation ceremony where he initiates them both into the Brotherhood and gives them a copy of the manifesto of the Brotherhood, the things that the Brotherhood is fighting for. And O'Brien tells Winston that maybe they will meet again soon. And Winston's like, yes, in the place with no darkness. And again, it's another sweet moment of hope and, encouragement that maybe things will get better. Winston gets home one day after a 90-hour work week because it is hate week. And so he has been having a lot of work of trying to change all the records and things. In fact, in the matter of a day, the country of Oceania switched allies and enemies. In fact, one speaker who was giving a speech about the enemies had to change the enemy halfway through the speech. And so the new enemy was Eurasia. And you can kind of see at the bottom of this slide how the world is broken up in 1984. Russia has taken all of Europe, and that's now called Eurasia. The United States kind of absorbed the United Kingdom, and that's called Oceania. And then the rest of the countries in the world are called East Asia. So there are these three main huge countries in the world, and they all kind of fight each other. So they switched alliances and everything so that there's war going on all the time, or it's supposed war going on all the time. Winston thinks and knows kind of that it's like a game, that if there's always one enemy, then it kind of keeps the people in power because of the fear and the you unite against your enemies. Yes, and so this is going on during Hate Week. But underneath that, at his home, Winston is reading the Manifesto of the Brotherhood, and it's all about fighting this power of fighting um, the lies, making the truth be seen, showing light on what's really happening, and that's kind of excites him. One day, Julia and Winston are up in the room above the secondhand shop, Mr. Charrington's secondhand shop, and they look out the window and there's a woman out there singing. It's a prole, one of the downtrodden's, but she's got a great voice. And they both are thinking that this is the future. The future is going to come out of people like her. And they say to each other, "We are dead." And then they hear a voice say, "You are dead." And suddenly there's a knock at the door and troops pour in. And they break the paperweight that's been so important to Winston. They tear that painting off the wall, and behind the painting is a telescreen. Big Brother has been watching the whole time. In fact, Mr. Charrington is part of that, and the voice that said "You are dead" is Mr. Charrington's. So it's been all a farce the whole time. There was no way they were going to get away with what they were doing. And so now Winston's in a bright cell where the lights are always on. Hopefully you kind of recognize what this means. This is the idea that they would meet one day in the place where there is no darkness. Well, it's not a good place. It's a cell where the lights are always on. There's people who come in to the prison cell. One of them is a poet who forgot to take the word God out of one of his translations. He's dragged to the infamous room 101. Winston is there, and he hopes that the Brotherhood sends him a razor blade so he can kill himself there in the prison. But before that happens, O'Brien comes in and he says, "Yes, I am a member of the Ministry of Love. I've been there the whole time, and we've been watching you the whole time. We know exactly who you are and what you've been doing." And they begin to torture Winston to get the truth out of him, or maybe for him to agree with the truth. Like, for example, O'Brien would be like, "How many fingers am I holding up?" And he'd only be holding up 4 fingers, but he'd want Winston to say 5. The idea is that no matter what untruth is told, they want to get a Winston to believe whatever untruths are told to him. And here's another famous quote here at the bottom. "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And so this really gets deep into this idea of history and how history informs the present and the future, and who controls how to interpret history. It's kind of the point of this whole class, right? Of where is the truth? Is it the truth in what people write and who writes what? And can anyone write something that is completely true, or is every history that's ever been written somehow tainted by the own biases of the writer and all that kind of stuff? Certainly, this quote is very important. Hopefully, you think about it a little bit. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So when we get into this concept of doublethink that the government wants every citizen to believe in, so no matter what is true, they want the truth to be whatever the government says. And so O'Brien says, "Yes, I'll answer your questions, Winston." And he says, "What about Julia?" And he says, "Julia betrayed you immediately." Winston's asked, "Does Big Brother exist?" And O'Brien's response to Winston is, "You don't exist." And Winston says, "Does a brotherhood exist?" And O'Brien says, "You'll never know the answer to that question." And Winston asks, "What's in room 101? And O'Brien says, "You know what's in room 101. Everybody does." There are weeks of torture of poor Winston. Winston keeps being defiant. He tells O'Brien, "You can't control everything. You can't control the stars." And O'Brien says it doesn't matter. Like, the only reality that matters is what we can get people to believe. So maybe we do control the stars, even if we don't necessarily physically control them. If we can convince people that we do, then that's all that matters. Winston looks in a mirror and he sees his face all, gray and gaunt and disheveled. And he blames O'Brien for this. And O'Brien's like, you know what? You kind of put up a good fight. I'm impressed by your strength. But it really doesn't matter because everyone is shot in the end. Winston's kind of coming around. He gets transferred to a less severe cell, where he's given a slate where he can write on, and he's been giving more food and a slate. And he writes things like freedom is slavery, 2 and 2 makes 5, and then God is power, which maybe we should have done that one. Because he thinks to himself he wants to die hating Big Brother, that no matter what, he does not want to ever love Big Brother. And O'Brien comes in and he's like, you must love Big Brother. You can't just be obedient. You can't just do what he says. You must love him. And O'Brien sends him to room 101, where he's strapped into a chair. And O'Brien knows the thing that Winston hates the most, is afraid of the most, is a bunch of rats. And so he brings this big cage of rats so close to Winston's face, and they're like trying to eat him. And O'Brien says that's what's going to happen. If you don't tell us what happened, we'll just let the rats crawl all over you and eat you alive. And so finally Winston cracks and he tells them exactly what happened and tells the truth. And so after he's done that, he's free, and he seems to be accepting of everything. He accepts Big Brother. He accepts the doublethink. He accepts newspeak, the truth, whatever. He sees Julia one day. There's no desire to get together. He remembers his mother and sister and like a happy moment with his mother and sister, but he's not sure if it was real or not. He sees a picture of Big Brother, and he says he feels happy and safe. And this quote at the end of the book, perhaps you pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. The end. I wish it was a happier ending, but there is nothing happy about 1984. So now the question is, I mean, if you know when this book was written in 1949, that perhaps it had something to do with what was going on in the world at the time, and the fear of totalitarianism and communism and dictatorship. But there's also been a lot through the years of applying what 1984's fears were to what was going on in the country today. And so think about that. I think I linked you to some articles about how 1984 might be interpreted or applied to things here in 2017. So good luck with your analysis, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks.